ولن يقفوا عند القدس ولا حتى عند الجولان ولا جنوب لبنان. هم مصممين على إزالة سوريا ولبنان من الخريطة وحدودهم على تركيا.
And what if I told you that an Arab leader nearly 40 years ago made a prophecy so bold that many today believe it is beginning to come true? In 1987, Muammar Gaddafi claimed that Israel would not stop until it laid waste to Syria and Lebanon. Are we now seeing signs of a frontier that would reach all the way to Turkey? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will take your breath away. Between heaven and earth.
ولن يقفوا عند القدس ولا حتى عند الجولان ولا جنوب لبنان. هم مصممين على إزالة سوريا ولبنان من الخريطة وحدودهم على تركيا. أنا أقول هذه كلام وتشوف هل يتحقق في عهدنا ولا في عهد أولادنا، لكن للأسف سيتحقق أن سوريا ولبنان المخطط يقضي بإزالتها حتى تبقى حدود ما يسمى بإسرائيل مع تركيا مش مع بلاد عربية.
In 1987, the world was living through a period of tensions that spread like an invisible web into every corner of the planet. The Cold War kept the great powers locked in an ideological and military contest that, although it never erupted into a direct clash between the United States and the Soviet Union, was waged through regional conflicts, strategic alliances, and an unceasing game of power. At the heart of that geopolitics was the Middle East, a territory where history, religion, and politics mixed with gunpowder. There, every word spoken by a leader could become an echo that crossed borders and unleashed new waves of uncertainty. It was in that setting that Muammar Gaddafi, the eccentric and enigmatic Libyan leader, issued a warning that still sparks debate today. Israel would not stop. It would lay waste to Syria and Lebanon, and its ambition would drive it to extend its borders all the way to Turkey. To grasp the weight of those words, you have to consider who Gaddafi was and what he represented in the second half of the 20th century. He had ruled Libya since 1969, after a coup d'etat that made him an influential figure in Arab politics. Admired by some as a defender of the Palestinian cause, and despised by others for his authoritarian style and ideological mood swings, Gaddafi was not a figure who went unnoticed. His speeches were explosive, theatrical, laden with symbolism, and often imbued with a tone that seemed to go beyond mere politics. He did not speak only as a head of state, but as someone who wanted to be seen as a visionary, a man with access to a truth others refused to acknowledge. By 1987, Israel had already cemented a reputation as an almost unbeatable military force in the region. It had demonstrated its power in the Six-Day War in 1967, seizing strategic territories, and in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when it withstood a surprise attack by Egypt and Syria. In 1982, just 5 years before Gaddafi's statement, the Israeli army had invaded Lebanon with the stated goal of expelling the Palestine Liberation Organization. That invasion, however, left a deep wound in the region's collective memory. Cities destroyed, thousands dead, and a country trapped in a civil war that seemed to have no end. It was within that framework of violence and chaos that Gaddafi raised his voice. In a speech that still echoes in the archives of Arab politics, the Libyan leader asserted that Israel would not settle for what it already had, that the occupation of southern Lebanon and control over the Golan Heights were merely steps in a larger plan. According to him, Israel's true aim was to advance northward, destabilize Syria, and ultimately erase borders until reaching Turkey. He did not present it as a remote possibility, but as a certainty, as if he had read a secret map where the future was already written out. The force of that speech lay not only in its content, but in the way Gaddafi delivered it. He did not speak with the cold, calculated tone of a military strategist, but with the cadence of someone who seemed to be pronouncing a prophecy. His words were infused with a nearly spiritual air, as if he wanted to warn that what was coming was not just a political maneuver, but the fulfillment of a greater destiny. It was a style that defined him. Gaddafi didn't just hurl accusations, he created images, scenarios, almost visions. And in 1987, when the Middle East was ablaze, that kind of language had a special power. Imagine, for a moment, the atmosphere of that year. In Beirut, explosions could still be heard in neighborhoods divided by civil war. Christian, Muslim, and Palestinian militias fought one another, while Syria intervened in the conflict, and Hezbollah began consolidating itself as an emerging force. In Damascus, Hafez al-Assad's regime maintained a fragile balance, locked in a standoff with Israel over the Golan and watching every move in Lebanon. In Jerusalem, the first Palestinian Intifada was just beginning, a revolt that filled the streets with stones, clashes, and despair. All of this was happening at once, and the echo of a speech like Gaddafi's found fertile ground for planting the idea that the worst was yet to come. The most intriguing detail of that declaration is not only the political analysis it contained, but the way it seemed to transcend it. It was as if Gaddafi were speaking with a voice borrowed from history, or perhaps from something deeper. His warning sounded less like a geopolitical calculation and more like a foreboding, like those ancient words that resound in sacred texts and describe inevitable catastrophes. Politicians sometimes adopt that tone to inspire fear or respect, but in this case, the cadence with which it was delivered left the impression that it was not mere rhetoric. That imaginary frontier he sketched, where Israel would extend to Turkey, seemed, in 1987, an impossible scenario. But it was precisely that impossibility that made his words so powerful. To propose the unthinkable in order to sow doubt as to whether, in reality, the region's course was already predetermined. And here arises the question that still shakes us today. Was Gaddafi speaking as a politician seeking to claim the spotlight amid crisis? Or was he reading the inevitable course of the end times? That question remains alive because every time the region enters a new spiral of violence, the Libyan leader's words resurface. It is not just a statement lost to time, but a disturbing reminder that, perhaps, history advances by following a script that had already been written, and that the leaders of the past, despite their excesses and contradictions, managed to glimpse part of that script. Gaddafi, with his unpredictable style, planted a warning that, like all prophecies, still awaits interpretation. Was it, then, mere political rhetoric, an attempt to provoke fear and rally the Arab world against Israel? Or was it, unwittingly, the voice of a man who bluntly articulated what the ancient prophets had already announced? That tension between the political and the spiritual is what turns his words into a mystery, an echo that still travels the region, and that even today forces us to ask how much of what we see in the present was already written in that 1987 speech. The history of Israel with Syria and Lebanon is the chronicle of a border that never knew peace. Since 1948, when the State of Israel was born, those boundaries became lines of fire, open scars that reignited every few years in new wars. To understand why Gaddafi's words resonated as an inevitable warning, it is enough to go through the milestones of those confrontations, which seemed drawn to confirm the idea that the region was destined for perpetual instability. In 1967, the Six-Day War broke out, a brief but devastating conflict that changed the map of the Middle East. In less than a week, Israel seized crucial territories: the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. For Syria, the loss of this last territory was an irreparable blow. The Golan Heights were not simply a plateau, they represented a strategic military advantage. a natural balcony from which northern Israel could be controlled and Damascus could be watched. Israel not only gained a privileged position, it also established a precedent. Territorial expansion could become a tangible reality, and that memory would remain engraved in the minds of its enemies. 6 years later, in 1973, Syria and Egypt launched a surprise attack against Israel in what became known as the Yom Kippur War. During the first days, it seemed as if the Arab forces might recover what had been lost, but Israel's response was overwhelming. In the end, Israel not only defended its borders, it once again demonstrated its ability to turn a threat into an opportunity. Syria's attempts to regain the Golan failed, and the open wound along that border deepened. Mutual distrust became routine, and military movements became part of the everyday landscape. Lebanon, for its part, became the scene of one of the darkest episodes in the region. In 1982, Israel launched a massive invasion under the justification of expelling the Palestine Liberation Organization, which operated from Lebanese territory. What began as a military operation turned into a long and bloody occupation. Israeli troops even reached Beirut, leaving behind a city marked by rubble and fear. The Lebanese civil war had already turned the country into a minefield of factions. But the Israeli invasion added a new element that would change the nation's destiny: the rise of Hezbollah. Hezbollah was born as a resistance movement, supported by Iran and fueled by the vacuum left by the weakness of the Lebanese state. Its growth was rapid, and it soon became a central actor on Israel's northern border. With its religious rhetoric and military capability, Hezbollah became the living demonstration that the 1982 invasion had not solved the problem, but had created an even more complex one. Since then, southern Lebanon and northern Israel have turned into a powder keg, where each skirmish could escalate into a major conflict. What is unsettling is how, looking back, each of these wars seemed to give weight to Gaddafi's words. Israel's expansion in 1967, Syria's defeated resistance in 1973, the occupation of Lebanon in 1982, and the emergence of Hezbollah appeared as pieces of a puzzle that always fit into the same place. The idea that the border was never meant to stabilize. Rather, it seemed pushed by a constant inertia toward new tensions, as if the flames could never be fully extinguished. At this point, many observers began seeing parallels between contemporary politics and ancient biblical prophecies. One of the most cited is Isaiah 17, where a chilling sentence is declared: Damascus will no longer be a city. It will become a heap of ruins. For centuries, this verse had been interpreted in many ways. But in the context of modern wars against Syria, the words took on a new meaning. Every bombing over Damascus, every threat of a major offensive, seemed to bring the scenario of that prophecy closer. Could it be that political events are not merely human decisions, but chapters of a script already written in the scriptures? This intersection between the historical and the prophetic is what keeps the concern alive. Because when you look at the map of the Middle East and review the decades of conflict, the border between Israel, Syria, and Lebanon appears not as a geographical limit, but as a wound that never heals. A wound that, far from closing, seems to open wider every time someone tries to mend it. The hypothesis that Israel could one day reach or brush the border with Turkey seems, at first glance, like an unthinkable scenario. However, when we look at the current map of the Middle East, with Syria fractured and Lebanon trapped in a perpetual crisis, the question becomes inevitable. What would happen if political and military conditions pushed Israel toward a northern direction that once seemed unreachable? Gaddafi's statement in 1987 now sounds like a shadowcast ahead of time, as if he had envisioned a chessboard where the pieces were destined to move beyond what anyone imagined. If Israel were to extend its sphere of influence all the way to the limits of Turkey, the map of the Middle East would undergo a radical transformation. We are talking about a new border connecting the State of Israel with a NATO member, a country with top-tier military capabilities and significant geopolitical weight, acting as a bridge between Asia and Europe. Such a border would not only reshape geography, it would trigger a strategic earthquake. Turkey, with its role as guardian of the Bosphorus Strait and its influence over the eastern Mediterranean, would shift from being a distant observer to becoming Israel's immediate neighbor. This proximity would alter alliances, open new tensions, and perhaps force a complete rethinking of the regional balance. But how could something like this actually happen? Today, Syria is no longer the robust nation it was under Hafez al-Assad. Since 2011, the country has been engulfed in a civil war that fragmented it into multiple zones of influence, with the regime controlling one part, rebel groups another, and foreign powers dividing the rest among themselves. Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the United States all hold direct or indirect presence in the territory. This mosaic of forces has turned Syria into a weak state, vulnerable to external pressure and increasingly susceptible to losing even more sovereignty to regional actors to the north. Lebanon faces one of the worst economic crises in its history, with a political system in ruins and a society barely resisting under blackouts, inflation, and the weight of militias. In a scenario where Syria and Lebanon continue to weaken, Israel would have a more open field to project its security beyond its current borders. What once seemed like an impossible dream could become a nearly inevitable strategic movement if the regional dynamics push it in that direction. At this point, a powerful intrigue emerges. Turkey, which until recently had tense relations with Israel, has taken steps toward a cautious reconciliation. Although both countries hold opposing interests on many fronts, they share common concerns, such as the threat of terrorism and energy security in the eastern Mediterranean. If Israel were to physically approach the Turkish border, it would not be only a military matter, but also an economic one. Oil pipelines, trade routes, and direct access to new corridors could redefine the regional economy. The possibility of a Turkey-Israel-Europe energy axis becomes more than a fantasy. Of course, the other side of the coin must also be considered. An extended Israeli presence toward the north could provoke fierce rejection in the Arab and Islamic world. Countries such as Iran would see it as an intolerable provocation, and groups like Hezbollah would intensify their narrative of resistance. It would be a tension-filled scenario where every move would have repercussions not only at the regional level, but globally. The United States, Israel's ally, would be compelled to strengthen its support, while Russia and other powers would need to redesign their strategies. Speaking of an Israel reaching the limits of Turkey also inevitably brings symbolism within prophetic interpretation. The Bible, in several passages, speaks of the north as the origin of dangers and conflicts that would come upon the land of Israel. Jeremiah 1:14, for instance, declares, "From the north, disaster will be poured out on all who live in this land." Although the original context of this passage is different, many contemporary interpreters find in these words a key to understanding today's tensions. Would it not be significant if Israel's border were to shift precisely in that direction, confirming again and again the centrality of the North in biblical prophecy? What is fascinating is how Gaddafi's political prophecy seems to intertwine with these biblical allusions. When he said that Israel would sweep through Syria and Lebanon until reaching Turkey, he may have spoken with political intent, attempting to warn or intimidate. Yet, without realizing it, he expressed an idea that echoes something much older. That convergence between the words of a modern leader and the voice of sacred texts creates an unsettling effect, as if layers of history had overlapped to form a single vision. The climax of this reflection arises when we observe how, despite changes in leaders, wars, and treaties, the Middle East continues moving toward what once seemed impossible. What Gaddafi voiced as a warning in 1987 now sounds like a prophetic echo that aligns with the pages of the Bible. And in that intersection, a sense of destiny emerges, a script that nations appear to follow, even if they do not recognize it. If Israel were ever to reach the border with Turkey, it would not be merely a military victory or a political maneuver. It would be a shift with spiritual implications, capable of reshaping not only maps, but belief systems. It would be as if the pieces that once seemed scattered, the warning from a Libyan leader and the ancient words of the prophets, finally aligned in the same timeline, reminding us that the political and the spiritual are not parallel paths, but roads that eventually meet. And here the question remains open. Vibrating like a tense string, are we facing a future still shaped by human decisions, or a destiny already written in the pages of history and prophecy? Because if the words of Gaddafi and the voice of the Bible converge, perhaps what once seemed impossible is simply the next page of a story still being written in the heart of the Middle East. If you want to discover more hidden prophecies and biblical mysteries unfolding before our eyes, subscribe now to Between Heaven and Earth and watch the additional videos that may interest you. What is coming, you cannot miss. May the blessing of God be with you.